following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. A traditional Snuneymuxw Village site in downtown Nanaimo is being returned to the nation, and an 1854 treaty played a part in getting the deal done. British Columbia and Snuneymuxw have bought one Terminal Ave and adjoining properties for $28.5 million, $26 million of which are coming from the province. The 2.67-acre site is across from Maffeo Sutton Park and includes the old Howard Johnson Hotel. The lands will be returned to Snuneymuxw. At an event announcing the news Monday, Snuneymuxw Chief Mike Wise spoke about the role of a 170-year-old treaty in reaching this point.
This moment is grounded in the Sarlequun Snuneymuxw Treaty of 1854, a treaty protected under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. The treaty promises to preserve and protect Snuneymuxw villages and marine areas forever and always for our people. The treaty also requires the recognition of Snuneymuxw rights when it comes to proposed development on our sacred village lands. Anyone who tries to come into our village and propose significant development must recognize Snuneymuxw people, our rights and way of life. Our nation will not support proponents who seek to deny the existence of our Snuneymuxw people, destroy our villages, and think they can do whatever they want without the voice of Snuneymuxw at the table. Today commemorates a moment in our history when the province of BC and Snuneymuxw First Nation stand together in solidarity. The proponents and the municipality must recognize Snuneymuxw First Nation and acknowledge our deep spiritual and cultural connections to these lands.
Between 1850 and 1854, 14 treaties were concluded on Vancouver Island between First Nations and the Hudson's Bay Company. They were negotiated on the company's side by James Douglas, who was also governor of Vancouver Island for the majority of that time. Some people call them the Douglas Treaties for that reason. One called the Sarlequun Treaty, covering the area around Nanaimo, was signed in 1854. We'll have more on the context of the treaties later on in the program. At Monday's announcement, BC's Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, Murray Rankin, also spoke about the 1854 treaty.
It's 170 years, this year, since the Douglas Treaty of 1854. That treaty promised a number of things that haven't always been honored. And it is our government's intention to do our part to rectify some of the injustices arising out of that breach.
In a media scrum following the announcement, Rankin reiterated the importance of the treaty from the province's point of view. Here are some excerpts from that media scrum.
We acquired the site as we do on a willing buyer, willing seller basis, and we intend, after the remediation is done, to turn it over to the First Nation, and they will go through the process of rezoning if required in order to realize their vision to protect the village site and perhaps do a lot more that will benefit not only them but the whole community of Nanaimo.
What do you envision for that property, Mike?
Yeah, we haven't really got to that stage yet. You know, it was obviously a sacred village site that we want to reconnect to as a community. So when it comes to time to putting plans forward, we'll bring that forward with our friends of the city, and we'll look at what we can do there.
Will the current facility there be torn down, and is there a timeline on that? Yeah,
we want to get that done as soon as possible, get it cleaned up. You know, like I said, that area is very sacred to Nanaimo. So, to clean it up and, make it safe for the greater community is very important.
We envisage fencing, we envisage potential remediation. We don't really know the state of the land. That is something we've put $1 million toward in order to just find out what's there.
Is there a timeline on when you expect to remove the derelict building?
Well, like I said, ASAP, just to make it safe. As you know, there's a bit of issues there, but I won't get to that right now.
Could the redevelopment of the site hinge on some of the archaeological findings that are there, Mike? I know that's from SFN's perspective, so there's been references.
That's always a concern for us. Throughout this coastline is where our people lived, so anytime you break ground, you want to be careful there. That one time our ancestors lived there at one time. So,
from our perspective, it's 170 years since the Douglas Treaty, where promises were made that would be protected as a village site. It obviously hasn't been. And so this is part of our journey of reconciliation together to make sure that that's restored. The property is I use acres. It's 6.6 acres in size. It's a very large property near downtown Nanaimo. It has enormous potential for everyone.
So to be clear, Minister Rankin, will the redevelopment be in concert with the province, or is this entirely led by Snuneymuxw?
It's the Snuneymuxw property after it's transferred. We intend to clean it up, as I said earlier, at least contribute to the cost of cleaning it up, and then it's for the nation to figure out its best use going forward.
Is this kind of a first for the province as far as the scale and the scope and the amount of work that went into making this happen?
We've done similar things, but not to this extent, and certainly not in Vancouver Island. The fact that there was a Douglas Treaty site is unique. I can't think of anyone else. I can't think of any other place where Douglas treaties exist. They're all on Vancouver Island, and we did not have any other experience of this. So it was unique to that extent. It was a real opportunity because I hate to use a cliche, but it's a win-win. It's part of our journey of implementing this 1854 treaty. Proud of that work we've done in other contexts, and we'll continue to do. This is just one of the many measures. But it also is going to, as the mayor said, with a wise development plan in place, approved by the city, it's going to be good for everyone in Nanaimo. And that's my point about a rising tide raises all boats. And I think that's what economic reconciliation means here today.
What finally led to this? I mean, it came very close to development and final approval many times. Yeah. What finally led to this?
As you know, we've filed a specific claim for this village site some years ago. So it's very sacred, and it's got a lot of history for our people. So without us being at the table, we had to come forward and make our case. And we've done that, and here we are today. So we're very thankful that we're here today talking about this land being transferred back to Snuneymuxw people.
During the scrum, I asked Chief Mike Wise about the role of the 1854 treaty in modern negotiations.
Well, we took that approach to make it known of our village sites from the past. Our treaty was signed in 1854 to protect our villages and to carry on life as was. So today we're here bringing that back.
Coming up on Midcoast Morning, we'll get into the history and context of the 170-year-old treaty that played a part in this week's news.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
Between 1850 and 1854, 14 treaties were concluded on Vancouver Island between First Nations and the Hudson's Bay Company. They were negotiated on the company's side by James Douglas, who was also governor of Vancouver Island for the majority of that time. So the treaties are sometimes called the Douglas Treaties. John Lutz was one of the organizers of a 2017 conference about the Vancouver Island Treaties. It was co-hosted by the University of Victoria and the Songhees Nation.
My name is John Lutz, and I'm a professor of history at the University of Victoria.
And where is the best place for people to start to try and understand what the Douglas Treaties are?
Actually, the best place is on the web. What are we now? 2014. Now, 7 years ago, we had a big conference at Songhees First Nation here in Victoria based on the treaties. And out of that conference came a pretty comprehensive website, which includes access to the text of all the treaties, including the Sarlequun Treaty, a timeline surrounding the making of the different so-called Douglas treaties. I prefer to call them the Vancouver Island treaties, because although Douglas was the maker on one side, of course, Indigenous people were active participants in shaping it on the other side. So I think the website is, if you just Google Douglas treaties, it'll come up.
And what you just touched on there was something I wanted to address in our conversation. So during the event yesterday, Chief Mike Wise referred to the treaty as the Sarlequun Treaty. Murray Rankin used the term Douglas Treaty. Can you help understand maybe what the Sarlequun Treaty, what that means for people who live in Nanaimo today, what the term is?
Sure. So James Douglas started making treaties with the local First Nations on Vancouver Island in 1850. Before he was actually governor, he was in charge of the Hudson's Bay Company, and they were actually given control of the land of the colony of Vancouver Island in 1849. So he later became governor and was making treaties. When he made treaty in Nanaimo, he was both governor and the land agent of the HBC. So he's actually, oddly enough, making treaties on behalf of the HBC rather than as governor. So he started making treaties with the local First Nations around Victoria in 1850. He made treaty with the Quagulth people around Fort Rupert in 1851 because there was also coal there. In 1852, he made a couple of treaties with the Wasanic people because they wanted access to the farm. And then in 1854, made a treaty with in fact, the Snuneymuxw Treaty, but Sarlequun, the word Sarlequun, I'm not exactly sure where it comes from, but it might have been just a corruption of Snuneymuxw.
Is there consensus that the written records we have of what's in the treaties matches up with what each party was agreeing to at the time they were kind of speaking and hashing these out?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's even more complicated in the Nanaimo case because he made 14 of these treaties overall. We have a text for 13 of them. There is no text for the Snuneymuxw Treaty, for the Sarlequun Treaty. It's just a blank page with the signatures underneath it, and we just assume that the text of the treaty is identical to the other 13 treaties. But as you suggest, and this is one reason why I don't like to call them the Douglas treaties, I'll have to go back in time for a second. So 1850, James Douglas thinks he better make some treaties with the local First Nations to secure the Hudson's Bay Company title. Around the same time, his superiors in London get the same idea. So they kind of write letters which cross at sea, suggesting that they make these treaties. Douglas convenes a meeting with the Songhees people, the different families here, and signs 9 treaties. But at that time, he leaves the text of the treaty blank and writes to London saying, I actually don't know what the treaty should say, so send me some text. So about 9 months later, the text of the treaty he had made 9 months before arrives in the mail from London, and he literally copies that on top of the signatures that he's acquired from the local First Nations. So with very little modification, actually only 1 or 2 lines did he actually modify from the template sent by London. So my view is that these treaties very much represent James Douglas's view of what he wanted and what the treaties contained. But the treaties were conducted orally in those early days in advance of any text. And I'm certain that the local First Nations didn't share the same ideas about the treaty as Douglas. And I can get into the reasons why the text of the treaty just does not represent an Indigenous view of the world at all.
Yeah, I want to. Before you do, I feel like it's almost necessary to reiterate what you just said. The text of the treaty, the Nanaimo, the Sarlequun Treaty, was sort of more or less dictated almost by people living in England who weren't there when the negotiations were made, and was sent on a letter and sort of affixed to these signatures. Did I get that?
Well, you got that right, with the exception of the Nanaimo case where there's no text at all in the treaty. Yes, so that's the one exception to the other 13. So, and we assume for the purposes of logic that text was identical because they're all identical across the other 13.
So what are the, putting that fact aside for a moment, in the case of the Nanaimo Treaty, like what are the things that this document that we don't have purportedly agrees to?
Well, today First Nations are signing treaties with the Crown, and they're, I think they range from 300 to 500 pages long, these treaties. These are, thoughtful, comprehensive documents. The treaties that Douglas signed with the local, and I put that signed in scare quotes, with the local First Nations, was just a couple of paragraphs. And the paragraph reads, if I summarize them, aside from describing the territory, and in this Nanaimo case, even that's very vague, what the territory surrendered included. But the rest of the text says, we, this Nanaimo people, give up our land to the white people forever and ever, with the exception of our village sites, our enclosed fields, and the right to fish and hunt. The right to fish as formerly and to hunt over unoccupied territories. That's what the treaty said. It says nothing about additional indigenous rights to to their graveyards, their cemeteries, to spiritual sites, to spiritual practices, to medicines. It's just not complete enough to suggest that First Nations really negotiated in a full way, the deal, basically. Yeah.
Given that, I don't know, what should people know, or what should people make about maybe what happened between when these treaties were signed and today? If we're talking, we're having an event in Nanaimo this week where these treaties are sort of the basis of what's going on.
Yeah, so, it's a bit shameful on the side of the Crown, really, because, first of all, they made the treaty and didn't even put any text in there, and presumably many of the desires and qualifications of the First Nations weren't included in this text. So I like to think of the treaties as an oral treaty, an agreement between two peoples that wasn't recorded in the written document. So we call those the Douglas forms and the Douglas contracts, but to me they don't really reflect whatever the meeting of minds was at the time. But having said that, then the Hudson's Bay Company and the colony of Vancouver Island, as it was then, didn't follow up to survey the village sites. It promised to protect your village sites and enclosed fields, and it was years later before they got around to surveying the village sites. And when they did, they actually sent the surveyor B.W. Pierce up to Nanaimo, and he surveyed I think 3 or 4 different reserves, but writes a letter saying, but the First Nations aren't living on those pieces of property. I've just kind of more or less, he didn't say this, but more or less randomly assigned tracts of land to them, and it's going to be a matter of time to move them onto those tracts of land. So he actually literally did not reserve the village sites, at least not all of them.
I want to play you a clip from the press conference. This was, or from a press scrum at the event announcing this land transfer in Nanaimo. This was Nanaimo Mayor Leonard Krogh speaking. There are a few things from there that I want to unpack. There's the main thrust of the mayor's statement about the idea of kind of ceded versus unceded lands in Nanaimo. But I wanted to maybe start with a statement in there he gave that, if he was a Snuneymuxw elder, he might look back with some displeasure on what his ancestors decided to do. Is there some historical context you think it's important to note when we hear a statement like that coming from a political leader?
Yeah, so I mentioned this conference in 2017, and out of it came a book called To Share and Not Surrender. And in that, I don't know, I'll say about a dozen academics kind of have investigated the context of the treaties in as close as we can. And I don't blame Mayor for not having read such an academic book. Few people do, but I think it's a complicated question. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think the written Douglas treaties or forms actually represent the oral agreement that the elders at the time and Douglas came to. So that's one point. Second point is that, of course, none of them could actually foresee the world a few years later. This is 1854. This is 4 years before gold is discovered on the mainland, and the colony of British Columbia is created. And the world literally was transformed by that discovery of gold. Until then, this Nanaimo had only met a few dozen, maybe 100 foreigners who had come with the Hudson's Bay Company to mine and to trade furs. So when they were agreeing to kind of hunt over unoccupied land, if that in fact was part of the oral agreement, they were essentially saying, we're going to let you have this little bit of coal land, and we keep the rest. So on the one hand, one can say that the land, was it ceded or not? It's a complicated question because, a treaty was signed, but was there a meeting of minds? Well, yeah, there probably was. Was that meeting of minds reflected in the written Douglas forms? I don't think so. So Mayor Krog's not wrong when he says this is a ceded land. The Snuneymuxw First Nation, basically holds that is a treaty, and that treaty contains certain specific rights that haven't been honored, including to reserve their village sites. I think ceded or unceded, that's an interesting question.
What kind of role do you think these treaties play broadly in maybe negotiations between First Nations and the provincial and federal governments? How do you think they change the situation versus other regions where there isn't something like this?
Yeah, good question. I think the local First Nations and was 14 treaties kind of made, and the different bands who have made the treaties have taken different approaches to what the treaties meant. So you have some like the Snuneymuxw and Songhees, others like Esquimalt, accepting these as kind of documents which surrendered certain land and rights, but also protected others. And then you have the Wasanic who say that this was a sharing treaty. We haven't surrendered anything, and we don't recognize this as a treaty. So different First Nations have taken different approaches to this, but the ones who have engaged in negotiations with the Crown over modern treaties, I think have taken the approach that what's guaranteed in the Douglas forms is just the bare minimum of what was agreed to, and then they're negotiating a modern treaty in addition. And when I say that, there are two specific rights included in the Douglas forms that don't form a part of other modern treaty negotiations. And those two lines are the right to the right to hunt over unoccupied land, and the right to fish as formerly. And the right to fish as formerly has not been tested in court, but that's a huge and powerful, it seems to me, fishing right that the treaty First Nations have, this Douglas Treaty or Vancouver Island Treaty First Nations have. And then the right to hunt over unoccupied territory probably should be extended to the right to hunt, to gather, to harvest. That's been enforced in court over hunting rights in the past, and basically saying that these First Nations hunting rights supersede provincial game laws. But I think there are other rights embedded in that the signatories to the Vancouver Island treaties could enforce that other First Nations don't have access to.
Are there other parts of this that you think it's important that people living on Vancouver Island today really understand?
Well, I think the point that the mayor made is an important one. That we actually are treaty people here on Vancouver Island, at least in chunks of Vancouver Island, southern Vancouver Island, Nanaimo, and around Fort Rupert, and that our ancestors made agreements with their ancestors, which look very one-sided from today's point of view, but they weren't even honored on the one-sided side. Their village sites weren't protected. Their enclosed fields weren't protected. Their right to fish as formerly has been denied, as it has some of the hunting rights. So I think as citizens of these territories, and Mayor Krog said this is a relative rarity in BC, as citizens of these territories, we are treaty people too. We are bound by those treaties, and we have to honor them. And the return of this land, a village site, is part of that honoring. But also, I think, as I said before, there are rights there in the treaties that have not been exercised, at least fully. And I expect in years to come, through negotiation or litigation, we'll see the fishing and hunting rights more clearly defined.
John Lutz, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me about this.
My pleasure. Happy to help.
John Lutz is a professor of history at the University of Victoria. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.